The perfect disaster. The grand cathedral stood as a testament to elegance and wealth. Massive stained glass windows lined the towering walls, depicting biblical stories in vibrant hues of blue, red, and gold. The soft hum of 1,000 whispered conversations filled the air, blending with the harmonious notes of a string quartet playing in the background. Rows of chairs, wrapped in ivory satin ribbons, faced a floral-adorned altar where the moment of a lifetime was about to unfold. At least that was what Amelia Harper had believed. She stood in the private bridal suite, facing a full-length mirror. The reflection staring back at her was breathtaking, yet unfamiliar. Her deep brown skin contrasted beautifully against the ivory silk of her wedding gown. The dress, a masterpiece of intricate lace and delicate embroidery, hugged her curves before flaring out in a dreamy cascade of tulle. Her hair was styled in flowing curls, a single diamond-studded pin securing one side. Her makeup was flawless, accentuating her high cheekbones and deep brown eyes that shimmered, not just with joy, but also with an unshakable nervousness. She ran her fingers along the smooth fabric of her gown, feeling the weight of expectation pressing down on her. Why did she feel like something was wrong? A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Sophie, her best friend and maid of honor, peeked in with a bright smile. "Are you ready?" Amelia hesitated before forcing a small smile. "As ready as I'll ever be." Sophie stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "Hey." She reached for Amelia's hands, noticing how cold they were. "What's going on? You look like you just saw a ghost." Amelia let out a shaky breath. "I don't know, Soph. Something doesn't feel right." Sophie frowned. "You love Daniel, right?" "Of course I do." "And he loves you." Amelia hesitated for half a second before nodding, but that tiny moment of doubt settled deep in her stomach like a stone. The words of Marilyn Whitmore, Daniel's mother, echoed in her mind like a venomous whisper. "She's not what we expected." Amelia had smiled politely when Marilyn said it, pretending not to hear the disappointment dripping from her tone. Pretending not to see the way Daniel's father, Richard Whitmore, had barely acknowledged her existence. Daniel had brushed it off, saying, "They'll come around. It's just different for them." Different. The word had lingered, but she had ignored it. She had convinced herself that love was enough to overcome anything. But standing here, moments away from walking down the aisle, she couldn't shake the gnawing doubt clawing at her chest. Another knock at the door. This time, it was the wedding coordinator. "It's time." Sophie squeezed Amelia's hands one last time before stepping back, smoothing out the lace of her dress. "You're going to be fine," she whispered. Amelia took one last deep breath before stepping forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. The double doors of the cathedral swung open, revealing a breathtaking sight. Hundreds of guests turned in unison, gasping softly at the vision of Amelia. The music swelled, the organist playing the soft, solemn tune of the wedding march. Her father, James Harper, stood beside her, his arm linked with hers. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," he whispered. Amelia swallowed the lump in her throat and smiled. Together, they took the first step forward. Her gaze immediately found Daniel at the altar. For a brief moment, her heart soared. He was handsome, tall, blonde, and dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. His blue eyes locked onto hers, but instead of the warmth and admiration she had expected, she saw hesitation. Something was wrong. Step by step, the aisle seemed longer than she had imagined. The hushed whispers in the crowd became deafening. She spotted Daniel's mother, Marilyn, with a knowing smirk on her face. Amelia's hands tightened around her bouquet. When she reached the altar, her father lifted her veil, pressing a kiss to her forehead before stepping back. Daniel didn't move. Instead, he exhaled sharply, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. A few guests exchanged confused glances. The priest cleared his throat, preparing to begin. And then Daniel stepped back. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Daniel?" Amelia's voice was barely a whisper. His jaw clenched. I can't do this, he said. Silence. Complete, suffocating silence. Amelia felt her knees go weak. Her hands trembled around the bouquet as her heart pounded in her ears. "Whoa, what do you mean?" she managed to ask. Daniel let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I should have never let it get this far." A confused murmur spread through the guests. Sophie stood frozen, her face a mask of shock. Amelia's father took a step forward, his expression hardening. Daniel turned toward the guests, his voice louder now. "This was never going to work. I was pressured into this." Amelia's breath hitched, pressured. Daniel looked back at her, and for the first time, there was no love in his gaze, only pity. "You're just not the kind of woman I should be with," he said, his voice dripping with finality. A sharp gasp erupted from the crowd. Amelia stood there, frozen in place, unable to process what was happening. Daniel's mother wore a triumphant expression, as if she had won some invisible war. "Daniel, please," Amelia whispered, but he had already turned away. He strode down the aisle, past the shocked faces of family and friends, past the stunned priest, past the altar where their vows were supposed to be exchanged. And then, just like that, he was gone. Amelia felt the weight of 100 stares piercing through her skin. A lump formed in her throat, but she refused to let the tears fall. Her mother rushed forward, reaching for her, but Amelia took a slow, steady breath. Then, with as much dignity as she could muster, she turned and walked away, not toward the exit where Daniel had fled, but down the opposite aisle, her head held high. She would not let them see her break. Not today. Not ever. And as she stepped outside into the cold, crisp air, the world seemed different. This was supposed to be the beginning of her life as a wife. Instead, it was the beginning of something far greater. She just didn't know it yet. Rising from the ashes, the soft hum of the city filled Amelia Harper's ears as she walked down the steps of the cathedral, her wedding gown dragging behind her like a ghost of the life she had just lost. A cold breeze blew through the streets, sending a shiver down her spine. But it wasn't the weather that made her tremble. It was the weight of humiliation pressing down on her chest. She felt the eyes of onlookers, some sympathetic, some judgmental, some merely curious, burning into her back. The murmurs followed her like shadows, whispers slicing into her soul like invisible knives. Did he really just leave her at the altar? I heard he said she wasn't his type, right in front of everyone. Poor girl, she must be devastated. She refused to break. With her chin held high, she kept walking, even as her vision blurred with unshed tears. The delicate lace of her wedding dress snagged against the pavement, the once pristine hem now ruined by dirt and dust. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. She had given everything to Daniel Whitmore. Her love, her trust, her future. And in return, he had crushed her dignity beneath his polished designer shoes, leaving her in ruins for the world to see. Behind her, the grand doors of the cathedral burst open. Amelia, her best friend, Sophie, sprinted after her, out of breath, still clutching the small bouquet she was meant to carry as maid of honor. "Amelia, please, just stop for a second." But stopping meant feeling, and if she felt, she would break. So she kept walking. Sophie caught up to her, placing a gentle but firm hand on her shoulder. "Amelia, where are you even going?" A sharp gust of wind sent Amelia's curls flying around her face. She brushed them away absent-mindedly. "Anywhere but here," she murmured. Sophie's eyes darkened with anger. "That bastard. I swear, if I ever see Daniel again, I'm going to." "Don't." Amelia cut in, her voice eerily calm. "He's not worth it." Sophie hesitated before nodding. "Okay, but you don't have to go through this alone. Come with me. My place is just a few blocks away. We can." "No." Sophie's face fell. "Then what are you going to do?" Amelia exhaled slowly, the weight of the world pressing on her chest. "I don't know yet," she admitted. But I know one thing for sure. I refuse to let him define me." With those words, she stepped off the sidewalk, hailing a cab. Sophie watched helplessly as her best friend disappeared into the city, leaving behind the shattered remains of what should have been the happiest day of her life. 1 year later, the air in New York City was electric, pulsing with life and ambition. Yellow taxis honked aggressively at pedestrians who dared to cross without looking. The scent of coffee and fresh bagels wafted from nearby cafes. The rhythm of the city matched Amelia's own heartbeat, fast, relentless, and full of possibility. Gone were the soft curls and the delicate lace gowns. Gone was the fragile girl who had stood at the altar, waiting for a man who never truly loved her. In her place stood a warrior. Amelia adjusted the sleeves of her sleek, form-fitting navy blue dress, the confidence in her stride undeniable. Her natural curls framed her face beautifully, accentuating her high cheekbones and deep brown eyes. Eyes that no longer shimmered with unshed tears, but with determination. She had rebuilt herself from the ashes. After Daniel's public betrayal, Amelia had thrown herself into her passion, fashion design. She had always loved sketching dresses, imagining a world where women of all shades and sizes could feel unstoppable in their own skin. She had started small, taking commissions, selling custom designs online, and stitching pieces late into the night in her tiny studio apartment. But soon, the world noticed. One viral social media post led to another, and before she knew it, she had launched her own brand, HUMILIATED. And now, after a year of relentless hard work, she was standing outside the doors of Vogue magazine, preparing to be interviewed for a feature that could change everything. Her fingers tightened around the leather handle of her designer bag, a bag she had designed herself, a reminder of how far she had come. She stepped through the glass doors, the scent of expensive perfume and fresh ink filling her senses. Miss Harper, a poised woman with sharp glasses and a clipboard, approached her. "Yes, that's me," Amelia said smoothly. "The editor is expecting you. Right this way." She followed the woman down a sleek hallway, her heels clicking against the polished floor. As she entered the interview room, a stunning blonde woman in a tailored white suit stood to greet her. "Amelia Harper," she said with a smile. "I've been dying to meet you." Amelia shook her hand confidently. "The pleasure is mine," she replied. And for the first time in a long time, she truly meant it. Meanwhile, Daniel Whitmore sat in his father's dimly lit office, his fingers curled around a crystal glass filled with whiskey. A year had passed since that day. A year since he had walked away from Amelia at the altar, convinced he had made the right decision. A year since his life had fallen apart. He had believed that leaving Amelia was the right thing to do. His parents had convinced him she wasn't the right fit for their prestigious family. They had whispered in his ear, feeding his doubts, telling him that a woman like her, a black woman from a modest background, could never belong in their world of wealth and influence. So he had let her go. But in doing so, he had lost everything. His engagement to Amelia had made headlines, not because of their love, but because of his public betrayal. Social media had torn him apart, branding him as a coward, a racist, a man who had left a strong, beautiful woman standing alone for the world to see. His business deals crumbled. His family's reputation suffered. And Amelia, she had thrived. Everywhere he turned, he saw her name. On magazine covers, on billboards, on the lips of every influential designer in the fashion world. And now, as he scrolled through his phone, his jaw tightened. Because staring back at him from the cover of Vogue was the woman he had thrown away. Amelia Harper, a headline blared beneath her radiant, confident smile. "The woman who built an empire from HEARTWAREG." Daniel's hand trembled as he took another sip of whiskey. For the first time in his life, he realized something that shook him to his core. He had made the biggest mistake of his life. And now, it was too late. A man's regret, a woman's rise. 1 year later, The grand ballroom of the Manhattan Elite Fashion Gala shimmered with opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over the sea of influential guests, celebrities, billionaires, and fashion icons who had gathered for one reason: to celebrate the meteoric rise of Amelia Harper. The air buzzed with whispers. She came from nothing and built an empire. Can you believe she was left at the altar? Look at her now. She's the most powerful designer in the game today. Standing on the red carpet, Amelia Harper exuded elegance. Her custom-designed navy silk gown hugged her curves perfectly, accentuated by delicate diamond earrings that glowed under the flashing lights of paparazzi cameras. Her once-long curls had been styled into an elegant updo, with soft tendrils framing her face. She was no longer just a heartbroken woman left behind. She was an unstoppable force. A journalist approached, microphone in hand, her excitement palpable. "Miss Harper, your brand, Harper Elite, has revolutionized the fashion industry. How does it feel to be honored as the designer of the year?" Amelia smiled, her confidence unwavering. "It's surreal," she said smoothly. "A year ago, I never imagined I'd be standing here, but hard work, resilience, and believing in yourself can take you further than you ever dreamed." The journalist nodded eagerly. "One last question. There are rumors that a certain someone might be in attendance tonight. Any thoughts on seeing Daniel Whitmore here?" For the first time, Amelia's smile faltered slightly. Daniel. The man who had publicly humiliated her, the man who had broken her in front of the world. She had long since moved on. Or so she thought. Amelia straightened her shoulders. "My focus is on celebrating this moment, not the past," she replied, her tone cool but polite. The journalist grinned. "Fair enough. Thank you, Miss Harper." Amelia turned, stepping toward the grand entrance of the ballroom. But even as she walked, she could feel it. A presence, a gaze burning into her back. And she already knew who it belonged to. Across the room, Daniel Whitmore stood near the bar, his fingers wrapped around a glass of whiskey. But he wasn't drinking. He was watching her. Amelia Harper, the woman he had let go. The woman who had risen far beyond his reach. She was radiant, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. And for the first time in his life, he felt completely powerless. "I was supposed to be the one by her side," he thought bitterly. His father's words echoed in his mind, words that had once seemed wise, but now felt like a cruel joke. "She's not our kind of people, Daniel. You need someone who fits our world." And he had listened. He had walked away, convincing himself that it was the right thing to do. Yet now, he was the one standing in the shadows while Amelia ruled the night. Beside him, his childhood friend, Elliot Harrington, let out a low whistle. "Man, you really screwed up," Elliot muttered, sipping his cocktail. Daniel's jaw clenched. "Not now," he said. Elliot smirked. "Oh, come on. You ghosted her at the altar, and now she's designer of the year. It's like a movie. A movie where you're the dumb villain." Daniel ignored him, his focus locked on Amelia. The way she glided across the ballroom, her confidence unshakable. The way other men's eyes followed her, full of admiration and desire. Daniel's grip on his glass tightened. He had lost her. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. An unwelcome encounter. Amelia was about to take her seat at the VIP table when she heard the voice she never wanted to hear again. "Amelia." She froze. For a split second, she debated ignoring it. But she knew that voice anywhere. Taking a deep breath, she turned. And there he was. Daniel Whitmore, looking just as devastatingly handsome as he always had. Tall, broad-shouldered, his dark tailored suit fitting him perfectly. His once arrogant eyes now held something she never thought she'd see. Regret. "Daniel," she said evenly, "didn't expect to see you here." He let out a breath, his fingers sliding through his hair. I needed to see you." She raised an eyebrow. "Why?" He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. I made a mistake, he said finally. Amelia laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. A mistake? She echoed. Daniel, you humiliated me. You left me at the altar in front of hundreds of people. You made me feel like I wasn't good enough. Daniel swallowed hard. I know, and I've regretted it every day since. She crossed her arms. What do you want, Daniel? He took a small step closer. A chance to make it right. Amelia exhaled, shaking her head. You don't get to do that. You don't get to leave me in ruins and then walk back into my life just because you suddenly realize what you lost. Daniel flinched. I was an idiot, Amelia. My parents. Stop. Her voice was firm. Your parents didn't leave me at the altar. You did, and I don't care about your regret, because I don't need it. I built myself back up. I thrived without you. Daniel's eyes darkened with pain. Goodbye, Daniel, Amelia said, turning away. But just before she could walk away for good, another voice cut through the tension. Is everything all right here? A deep, commanding voice. A voice Amelia had grown to love. She turned to see Ethan Monroe, the CEO of an international fashion conglomerate and one of the most powerful men in the industry. And her new boyfriend. Ethan slid his arm around Amelia's waist, his presence solid and unwavering. Daniel's face fell. Amelia smiled up at Ethan. Everything's fine, darling. Ethan's gaze flickered to Daniel before he kissed Amelia's temple. Good. Your award ceremony is about to start. Let's not keep the world waiting. With one last glance at Daniel, one that held neither hatred nor longing, but pure indifference, Amelia turned and walked away, hand in hand with Ethan. And for the first time ever, Daniel Whitmore knew what true regret felt like. The weight of regret and the power of moving on. The taste of defeat. Daniel Whitmore stood frozen in place, watching Amelia walk away with another man's hand in hers. His chest tightened, a strange sensation clawing at him. Something unfamiliar, something suffocating. Loss. And not just any loss. This was the loss. The kind that alters the course of a man's life forever. He had once thought he was above pain, above consequences. But now he was nothing but a man drowning in his own regret. Elliot, his longtime friend, who had been silently observing the entire exchange, let out a low whistle before taking the sip of his whiskey. Wow, Elliot muttered. That was painful to watch. Daniel didn't respond. His gaze remained locked on Amelia as she was escorted toward the stage, where a thunderous applause awaited her. Ethan Monroe, the man Daniel instantly loathed, helped her onto the platform, placing a kiss on her hand before stepping back. She was glowing, standing before the world as a queen. And Daniel, he was nothing but a fool in the audience, watching his greatest mistake bask in her well-deserved triumph. The speech that cut like a knife. Amelia stood at the podium, staring out at the sea of faces. She had prepared for this moment. She had rehearsed her words, planned every sentence carefully. But as she looked out, her eyes instinctively landed on him. Daniel Whitmore, the man who had once made her question her worth. A part of her had wondered, if she ever saw him again, would she feel bitterness? Would she feel sadness? Would she feel anything at all? But standing here, on this stage, with the world celebrating her success, she felt only one thing. Freedom. Taking a deep breath, she smiled and spoke into the microphone. There was a time when I believed my worth was tied to how others saw me, she began. The room grew silent. Daniel leaned forward, hanging onto every word. I thought that if I was loved, if I was accepted by the right people, I would be enough. But life has a way of teaching you that your worth isn't defined by others. It's defined by you. The crowd murmured in approval. Daniel's throat went dry. 1 year ago, I was left broken. Amelia continued, her voice unwavering. And for a moment, I thought I had lost everything. But then I realized, being broken is not the end. It's the beginning. A wave of applause filled the room. Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words press down on his chest like a crushing tide. She wasn't speaking about just anyone. She was speaking about him, about what he had done to her, about how she had risen despite it. And now, standing here today, I understand something I never did before, Amelia said, locking eyes with Daniel from across the room. A person's greatest power is not in how they are loved by others, but in how they learn to love themselves. A standing ovation erupted. Ethan smiled proudly. Daniel felt like his entire world had collapsed. The empty penthouse. That night, Daniel returned to his penthouse, the city skyline stretching out before him through the massive glass windows. But the view no longer felt grand, no longer felt powerful. It just felt empty, just like him. His phone buzzed. A message from his mother. "Your father and I saw the gala on television. We hope you didn't embarrass yourself." Daniel clenched his jaw, tossing the phone onto the couch. For years, he had listened to them. He had obeyed. He had sacrificed love for a life that was supposed to be perfect. Yet now he sat in a cold, lifeless penthouse, alone. While Amelia had everything he had ever wanted. And the bitter truth, she had found it without him. He ran a hand over his face, his reflection staring back at him from the window. For the first time in his life, Daniel Whitmore felt powerless. And worse, he knew he had no one to blame but himself. Amelia's next chapter. Meanwhile, across the city, Amelia stood on the rooftop of her design studio, a glass of champagne in her hand. She took a deep breath, letting the night air fill her lungs. Ethan stepped beside her, his presence warm and steady. "You okay?" he asked. She turned to him, smiling softly. "I am." And for the first time in a long time, she truly meant it. The past no longer held her captive. Daniel Whitmore was nothing more than a lesson she had learned. And her future was limitless. A man's reckoning and a woman's rise. The weight of an empty life. Daniel Whitmore had always been a man who thrived on control. Control over his career. Control over his relationships. Control over his image. But now everything felt out of control. It had been 3 weeks since that fateful gala. 3 weeks since he had seen Amelia in all her glory, standing tall, radiant, and untouched by the pain he had inflicted upon her. 3 weeks since she had spoken words that cut deeper than any blade. Words that haunted his nights. A person's greatest power is not in how they are loved by others, but in how they learn to love themselves. Daniel sat alone in his office, the city skyline stretching before him. The view that once symbolized his triumph now felt like a prison. He had wealth. He had status. He had everything his parents had told him to chase. Yet, he had never felt emptier. His assistant knocked lightly on the door, peeking in. "Mr. Whitmore, your father's on the line. He says it's urgent." Daniel exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders back. "Put him through." A click. Then came the familiar, disapproving voice of Charles Whitmore. "Daniel, your performance at that gala was humiliating." Daniel's grip tightened around his glass of scotch. "The press is already speculating. We don't need your name attached to some ridiculous scandal about an ex-flambeau." "Her name is Amelia," Daniel interrupted, his voice colder than steel. His father scoffed. "I don't care what her name is. What I care about is you embarrassing yourself over a woman who is no longer relevant to your future." Silence. Daniel clenched his jaw. "I suggest you pull yourself together, son. The board is watching. If you want to maintain our legacy, you can't afford distractions." Click. The line went dead. Daniel leaned back in his chair, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. His legacy. He had spent his entire life building someone else's dream. And in doing so, he had destroyed the only thing that had ever truly mattered. Amelia's next move. On the other side of the city, Amelia sat in a sunlit cafe, sipping a lavender latte. Across from her, A woman in her mid-40s, with sharp green eyes and a billion-dollar empire to her name, smiled approvingly. Your designs, Amelia, are revolutionary. I want your brand under the Vanderbilt fashion house. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. Victoria Vanderbilt, the most powerful woman in fashion, was offering her a deal. But Amelia had learned something over the years. Never jump at the first offer, no matter how tempting. Leaning back, she smiled, choosing her words carefully. I'm honored, Victoria, but I have to ask, why now? Why me? Victoria chuckled, stirring her espresso. Because I see what others failed to see in you years ago, she said, locking eyes with Amelia. You have the talent, the fire, the resilience. I watched what happened at your wedding. I saw the media tear you apart. And then I saw you rise. That is the kind of woman I want leading a division under my brand. Amelia exhaled slowly, processing the moment. She thought about the years she had spent building herself back up. The long nights, the failures, the victories. And now, the world was watching. I won't be just another designer in your house, Amelia said firmly. Victoria's lips curled into a smile. No, darling, you'll be a partner. And just like that, Amelia sealed her future, the unfinished business between them. That night, Daniel stood outside the doors of Everett and Monroe Fashion House. His heart pounded in his chest. What was he even doing here? He had tried to move on. He had tried to convince himself that she no longer mattered. But it was a lie. She had always mattered. And now he needed to face the truth. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. A receptionist glanced up, startled. Mr. Whitmore, is Amelia in? He asked. She hesitated before nodding. She's in a meeting. But, I'll wait, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. 45 minutes later, Amelia stepped into the lobby, scrolling through her phone. She didn't notice him at first, but when she finally lifted her gaze, her entire body went still. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with a carefully neutral expression, Amelia sighed. What do you want, Daniel? Her voice wasn't cold. It wasn't angry. It was indifferent, and that hurt more than anything. Daniel swallowed. Can we talk? Amelia glanced at her watch. I have a flight to Paris in 3 hours. Make it quick. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. She was leaving. He nodded, motioning toward the door. Can we at least go somewhere private? She hesitated before sighing. Fine. 5 minutes, Daniel. That's all you get. The apology that came too late. They sat across from each other in a dimly lit lounge. Daniel struggled to find the right words. How could he undo years of damage in a single conversation? I was a coward, he finally admitted. Amelia raised a brow. You were more than that. He exhaled sharply. I let them control me. I let my fear of disappointing my family destroy the one thing I actually cared about. Amelia stirred her drink, unfazed. And now that you see me on magazine covers, you suddenly regret it. Daniel flinched. That's not. Save it, Daniel, she interrupted. I don't need your guilt. I don't need your apology. She leaned forward, her expression unreadable. You weren't just my fiancé. You were my best friend. And you threw me away like I was nothing. Now you want to sit here and act like you suddenly understand what you lost. Silence. Daniel clenched his fists. I do understand, he said quietly. And I know I don't deserve another chance. But Amelia, I never stopped. Don't, she cut him off, her voice firm. He stared at her. She took a deep breath and shook her head. You don't get to say that now, Daniel. Not after everything. She stood, grabbing her purse. I've moved on, and I suggest you do the same. And just like that, she was gone. Daniel sat there, staring at the empty seat across from him, the realization sinking in. This wasn't a game. This wasn't a phase. Amelia was truly, irrevocably gone. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Whitmore understood what it felt like to lose something that no amount of money could ever bring back. A man's redemption and a woman's new dawn. The hollow life Daniel built. Daniel Whitmore had lost control. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one calling the shots. He sat in his penthouse, staring at the untouched whiskey glass on the table. Normally, he would have drowned his regrets in liquor, but tonight, it wasn't enough. The air was thick with silence, the kind that made his mind wander, the kind that reminded him of all the mistakes that led to this moment. For years, he had been the man everyone admired, the man everyone feared. Yet, in the end, he had become a man no one truly cared about. His phone buzzed. A message from his assistant. "Your father wants to schedule a meeting. Board wants reassurance about the upcoming merger." The company, the one thing he was raised to prioritize above all else. And yet, it felt meaningless now. Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. He had spent his entire life building an empire, but somehow Amelia had built something far greater. A life worth living. And that truth burned more than any rejection ever could. Amelia's power move. 2 weeks later, Paris greeted Amelia with its timeless charm. She sat at the head of a conference table, the Vanderbilt fashion house executives surrounding her. Victoria Vanderbilt, the woman who had given her this opportunity, smiled knowingly. "Well, Amelia," she said, leaning back in her chair, "the world is watching, and they're waiting to see if you're just a rising star, or if you're the next unstoppable force in fashion." Amelia smirked. "Then let's give them something they'll never forget." A sleek portfolio was placed on the table. Her new line. Elegant, bold, unapologetic. The designs were a reflection of her journey, from heartbreak to triumph. From a forgotten fiancée to a woman who owned her destiny. The room was silent as the executives studied her work. Then, Victoria tapped her manicured nails against the table. "This collection is a risk," she said. "It's unlike anything the market has seen." Amelia met her gaze. "Good, because I'm not here to play it safe." A slow smile spread across Victoria's face. "Then welcome to the top, darling." And just like that, Amelia didn't just enter the fashion world. She dominated it. Daniel's fall from grace. Back in New York, Daniel's world was crumbling. He sat in the boardroom, surrounded by the same executives who once worshipped him. Only this time, the energy was different. His father, Charles Whitmore, stood at the head of the table, voice laced with frustration. The merger fell through, Daniel. Daniel's stomach dropped. "What?" One of the executives cleared his throat. "The investors lost confidence. They don't believe you're stable enough to lead anymore." Silence. Daniel's fingers curled into a fist. "So, what? You're cutting me out." Charles exhaled sharply. "You did this to yourselves, son. You got distracted. You let your emotions cloud your judgment." Daniel's chest tightened. "And by distraction, you mean Amelia." Charles gave a cold smile. "I mean weakness." The room was silent. Daniel could feel the weight of his father's words sinking in. For years, he had lived by his father's rules, had shaped himself into the perfect hair. And yet, when he needed support the most, they were throwing him aside. "You're making a mistake," Daniel said, voice dangerously low. Charles' expression didn't change. "No, Daniel, you did." And just like that, the company Daniel had sacrificed his soul for was no longer his. A crossroads. Daniel spent the next few days in isolation. He ignored calls, meetings, the press. For the first time in his life, he was completely alone. But strangely, there was relief in the silence. For once, he wasn't drowning in expectations. For once, he had the chance to decide who he wanted to be, not who his father told him to be. And he knew exactly where he needed to go. A face from the past. Amelia was in Milan, overseeing the final touches for her collection's launch. The last thing she expected was a familiar voice behind her. Impressive. You always did have an eye for beauty. She froze. Slowly, she turned. Daniel Whitmore stood there, hands in his pockets, a look in his eyes she had never seen before. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't regret. It was something else entirely. "What are you doing here?" she asked, keeping her voice even. Daniel hesitated. For the first time, he didn't have a rehearsed speech. No calculated words. No hidden agenda. "Honestly, I don't know," he admitted, "but for the first time in my life, I want to figure it out on my own, without my father, without my company, just as me." Amelia crossed her arms. "And what does that have to do with me?" Daniel exhaled. "Nothing and everything." A long silence. Then Amelia smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Well then, Daniel," she said, tilting her head, "let's see who you really are."